Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita, Kansas government and public policy. We're broadcast on KGPT channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me from my blog. It's the Voice for Liberty at wichitaliberty.org on the internet. There, the motto is individual liberty, limited government, and free markets in Wichita and Kansas. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, just visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, you can like the Voice for Liberty on Facebook, and do follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. For the past month or so, the Kansas legislature has been trying to balance the state's budget. The problem is simple. There is not enough tax revenue to pay for the spending the legislature has decided on. 3 years ago, the state lowered income tax rates. That was a good thing. But what the state did not do at that time is to start looking at the spending side of the equation. Yes, there have been a few cuts here and there, but not nearly enough. The Kansas legislature has had several years to come up with plans for reforming government spending, but it did not do that. Now, leaders in the Kansas legislature and executive branch tell us the only way to balance the Kansas budget this year is by raising more revenue through taxation. And that may be true, as reforming spending and budgeting takes time to accomplish. We, the legislature, we had the time. But our legislature and executive branch squandered that opportunity. Now they ask you for more tax revenue. A few weeks ago, I told you about several initiatives the legislature had looked at but rejected. These are things like a streamlining commission and a commitment to outsourcing. Other states have done things like zero-based budgeting and priority-based budgeting. A few months ago on this show, Dave Travert of Kansas Policy Institute explained the plan KPI developed for balancing the budget. There are many things the state could do to balance the budget other than raising taxes. But the choice that is being made in Topeka is to raise taxes. Now, our state's lawmakers are bickering over just which taxes to raise and by how much. A common theme you hear from lawmakers in Kansas news media is that the state can't afford the tax cuts of 3 years ago. But this is a backwards way of looking at the relationship between government and its subjects. When someone says we can't afford tax cuts, that presumes a few things. First, it presumes that the previous level of taxation was somehow better than the current level. That's a tough argument to make, as when Kansas had higher taxes, our state economy was not growing very well. Second, it presumes that tax cuts have a cost that can't be afforded. The only way this is true is if we believe that the state has the first claim on our incomes. The state takes what it believes it needs, and we get to keep the rest. Then if somehow the government is persuaded to give any of that claim back to us, well, this gift has to be paid for. But for those who believe in self-ownership, this is nonsense. It's the people who give tax money to the government, not the government who gives it back in the form of tax cuts. If the government cuts taxes, the government gives us nothing. It simply takes less of what is ours in the first place. But the attitude of many government officials is just the opposite. In 2006, for example, Kansas cut taxes on business equipment and machinery. At the time, Governor Kathleen Sebelius said, "We're not giving away money for the sake of giving it away." As you can see, for the former governor of Kansas, letting business firms keep a little more of the money they earn means the state is giving it away. And we see this line of thinking all the time. There are huge constituencies that rely on government spending. Schools and state employees are too, but there are many others. For example, companies that benefit from highway construction have their own lobbying group to pressure legislators to spend more on highways. This list goes on and on. These groups will spend a lot of effort in order to receive appropriations from government. It's easier than competing in markets and customers for business. It's perhaps the largest problem with government spending. Decisions are made by a few centralized actors who are subject to intense lobbying by special interests. It is the well-known problem of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs that we've talked about before on Wichita Liberty TV. It's also easy for lawmakers to make promises that they don't keep. I'm not talking about promises made during campaigns, although there are problems there, certainly. I'm talking about our state's employee pension plan, or CAPERS. In Kansas, like in many states, lawmakers have not contributed enough money to the fund to pay for the benefits it promises state employees. Kansas has made a small move towards reform of its state pension plan, but not nearly enough. So in Topeka, we find lawmakers bickering over the details of how much to raise taxes. This did not need to happen. This is a problem entirely of their own making, but I'm afraid to tell you that you will have to pay to fix it. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. A Wichita newspaper op-ed piece is either ignorant of or decides to forgive and excuse bad behavior in Wichita government, particularly by then mayoral candidate Jeff Longwell. In a column just before the April 2015 Wichita election, Bill Wilson, who was managing editor of the Wichita Business Journal, reported on fallacies during the mayoral campaign, fallacies that he called glaring. But only a juvenile interpretation of the facts surrounding these events could find them fallacious. This is especially troubling since Wilson covered City Hall as a reporter for the Wichita Eagle. The first reported fallacy concerns the award of the contract for the new Wichita Airport Terminal. Jeff Longwell, then a city council member and now our mayor, he had received campaign contributions from executives of Key Construction, the local company bidding on the contract. He also received contributions from Wallbridge, the Michigan partner of Key. The Wallbridge contributions are problematic as they were made just a few days before the vote, and more arrived a few days after Longwell's vote. In his column, Wilson had an explanation as to why the council voted the way it did. That explanation was a matter of dispute that the council had to resolve. But the validity of the explanation is not the point. The point is something larger than any single issue, which is this. The Wichita City Council was asked to make decisions regarding whether discretion was abused or whether laws were improperly applied. It is not proper for a city council member to participate in decisions like this while the ink is still wet on campaign contribution checks from a party to the dispute. Plain and simple, Jeff Longwell should not have voted on this matter. And for that matter, several other council members should not have voted. Wichita City Council member James Clendenin, he represents District 3, Southeast and South Wichita, and is now Wichita's vice mayor. He received substantial campaign contributions from Key construction executives several months before he voted on the airport contract. So too did Wichita City Council member LaVonda Williams. She represents District 1, Northeast Wichita. In fact, the only contributions Williams received in the whole year 2012 were from Key Construction interests, its executives and their spouses. Then we have former Wichita Mayor Coral Brewer. We've seen the pictures of him fishing with his friend Dave Wells of Key Construction. Do you think it is proper for the mayor to have voted in a quasi-judicial role on a matter worth millions to his fishing buddy? How do you feel about the mayor voting for no-bid construction contracts for his friend, contracts that were later found to be overpriced? In Wichita, we see city council members receiving campaign contributions while participating in a quasi-judicial proceeding involving the contributors. And this doesn't seem to be improper for the Wichita Business Journal. But it isn't alone. The Wichita Eagle does not object to any of this either. Well, maybe once in a while it does, but not very strenuously or for very long. Another problem. In his op-ed, Wilson dismisses the claim that Longwell was able to exert much influence over the other 6 council members in order to benefit a project in his council district. But during the campaign, Longwell eagerly took credit for the good things that the council did. Though Longwell was but one of 7 votes, his commercials made it seem like he performed these deeds all by himself. But when things go wrong, well, he's just one of 7 votes. And the last fallacy Wilson objected to is this. He wrote, "The idea that a $500 campaign contribution buys a vote, a specious claim made by Americans for Prosperity that inexplicably lives on. If a council member's vote is for sale for $500, their stupidity trumps their corruption. And yet some of these false claims remain in political advertising despite being debunked by 2 media outlets and here." Well, a few points. First, it's not just a $500 contribution. We find many examples of individual $500 contributions from executives of the same company, along with spouses and other family members. These contributions are being stacked. Second, sometimes campaigns are funded to a large extent by these stacked contributions from just 1 or 2 business firms. And third, if these contributions are not seen as valuable to those who make them, why do the same small group of business interests make the same maximum contributions year after year? And as far as the claims being debunked, a few weeks ago I showed you the inexplicably bad reporting from the Wichita Eagle. Well, the Wichita Business Journal did not do any better. Wilson's op-ed seems more like an audition for a job at City Hall than a critical look at the campaign and its issues. And making a move from news media to government jobs and communications is a common career move. There are 3 former journalists working in Wichita City Hall. One former Wichita Eagle reporter went to work for the Wichita School District, and there are many examples of this in Topeka. It's a problem when journalists who are supposed to be exercising watchdog duty over government agencies wind up working for them. We can also recognize when journalists are auditioning for jobs in government. And problems like this are widespread. Recent discussion about restricting the ability to spend welfare benefits in Kansas inspired one newspaper editorialist to compare elected politicians with welfare recipients. The writer was Dave Helling of the Kansas City Star, and his target, Kansas Governor Sam Brownback. Attempting to paint the governor as a government-paid freeloader, Helling wrote, "He's earned his living from taxpayers almost all his life. He's worked in state government, the U.S. House, and the U.S. Senate, and now as governor where he earns around $100,000 a year." Well, except Helling's own words undermine his point. He wrote that Brownback earned his living. Well, welfare recipients are not earning their benefits. And he also wrote that Brownback worked in government, and welfare benefits recipients are not working for their benefits. Well, Helling made a few other nonsensical arguments in order to criticize the governor. Then, this op-ed from the Kansas City Star was mentioned by the Wichita Eagle, where editorial writer Rhonda Holman added, "Brownback has held a government job since he became state agriculture secretary in 1986 at the age of 30. Well, isn't it curious that the Eagle editorial board would criticize someone for working for government? Its usual stance is that there should be more government workers. But when there's a chance to criticize the governor, well, anything goes, it seems. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. What is classical liberalism? Not to be confused with modern American liberalism or liberal Republicans, classical liberalism places highest value on liberty and the individual. This is what libertarians believe. In this video, Nigel Ashford of the Institute for Humane Societies explains the tenets of classical liberalism. Modern American liberals, or progressives as they often prefer to be called, may value some of these principles, but most, such as free markets and limited government, and I would add individualism and toleration, are held in disdain by them. And conservatives don't like some of these things either.
What is classical liberalism? It's a set of ideas that places the freedom of the individual as its central feature. Classical liberals disagree about many things, but they agree, I think, on 10 core principles. Number one is that liberty is the primary political value. We all have lots of different values. We care about our family, our church. But when it comes to deciding what to do politically, what should the government do, classical liberals have one clear standard. Does this increase or does it reduce the freedom of the individual? The government should only act to prevent harm to others. Second principle, individualism. That the individual is more important than the collective. We should not sacrifice the interests of individuals for what some people argue is the common good. This was the central feature of communism and fascism. The individuals didn't matter. Every individual matters. Every individual is worthy of respect. Third principle, skepticism about power. Power is the ability to get other people to do what you want that otherwise they would not do. Government, for example, often claims we're forcing you to do X because it's in your own interest to do so. Whereas very often, when people with power do that, it's really because it's good for themselves. Classical liberals believe that the individual is the best judge of their own interests. We can try and recommend things, but in the end, the individual is the best judge of their own interests. Other people should not force them to do things that they do not want to do. Fourth, the rule of law. This is the idea that there's some higher principles by which we should examine what government does, laws that are passed, government actions. Just like the US Supreme Court will sometimes strike down pieces of legislation that Congress has passed and the President has signed because it goes against certain principles embodied in the US Constitution. Classical liberals believe that certain principles of the rule of law should be applied to what every government does anywhere in the world. A classic example is equality before the law. People should be treated the same regardless of their race or gender or sexual orientation. That's why classical liberals have always objected to the idea that there should be laws that treat, say, blacks and whites differently. 5. Civil society. Civil society are those voluntary organisations that exist between the individual and the state. Classical liberals believe that most social problems can be more effectively dealt with through these voluntary organisations like the family, like the church, like charitable organisations, because they have the knowledge about the individuals in which they're dealing with. Civil society is much more effective than government bureaucracies and inflexible rules that can't change depending on people's individual circumstances. So the civil society can do many of the things that we now look to for the welfare state to do. 6. Spontaneous order. Order, it means the existence of regularity and predictability in the world. When people are making decisions about what to do, they need to be able to predict what the results of making those decisions should be. Many people seem to assume that order requires some institution, some body to manipulate and organise things. Classical liberals don't believe that. They believe that order can arise spontaneously. People, through their voluntary interaction, create the rules by which people can live by. classic example is that of language. Nobody invented the English language. It arose in terms of people communicating with each other, and yet certain rules have applied through that process. We don't need people to plan our lives. 7. Free markets. That economic exchange should be left to voluntary activity between individuals. Government should not tell people where to work, how to save, what to build, what to produce. This should be left to voluntary interaction by people. You need private property to be able to do that, and you need to ensure that when there is disputes, they can be peacefully resolved. But history shows us is that leaving things to free markets rather than government planning or organisation increases prosperity, reduces poverty, increases jobs, provides goods that people want to buy. 8. Toleration. Toleration is the belief that one should not interfere with things of which one disapproves. Toleration does not mean that you allow people to do things because you agree with it, because you think it's a good thing. It's a question of having certain moral principles. I think this action is wrong, but I will not try and force my opinions, for example, through government, to stop the things that I disapprove of. A classic case of that for classical liberals is free speech. People should be allowed to say things of which we strongly disapprove. We're tolerating things even though we dislike and disapprove it. 9. Peace. Peace is a state where we can go about our business without violence or war. That's best achieved, according to classical liberals, is not by interfering in other countries. In other words, they favour a non-interventionist foreign policy. Their view in terms of our interaction with other nations, it should be based on what's commonly called the 4 freedoms. There should be free movement of capital and labour, people, goods and services. And I would add something as well, the free movement of ideas. If we have a world in which this free movement is embraced, then I think we'll have a world, and classical liberals believe, we would have a world based on peace. And finally, limited government. That there are very few things on which the government should do. The goal of the government is simply to protect a life, liberty and property. Anything beyond that is not justifiable. A strictly limited government. So these are the 10 principles of classical liberalism. Are you a classical liberal?